Welcome. This is Inside Without Now, a live brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam, one of those volunteers. And I'm excited to be with you tonight. Refuse Fascism is a nationwide movement of people coming from diverse perspectives, united around the recognition that the Trump-Pence regime poses a catastrophic danger to all of humanity and the planet itself, and that it must be driven from power through sustained mass nonviolent protests that don't stop until the demand Trump-Pence out now is won. So be sure to follow us if you don't already at Refuse Fascism on all platforms. Tonight's topic is inside the fight to defeat the political persecution of the Freeway 9. Again, inside the fight to defeat the political persecution of the Freeway 9. A live discussion on the victory in the Freeway 9 case with a defendant and their attorney. All criminal charges have been dismissed against the Refuse Fascism protesters who took action in Los Angeles on the 101 freeway in 2017, demanding the Trump-Pence regime must go. After almost 3 years of relentless persecution for demanding Trump-Pence must go. This case has important lessons for us all at a time when this regime is most needed to be driven from power at the soonest possible times, as deaths continue to skyrocket from COVID and the science-denying regime carries out genocidal dismissal of science, of fact. Share this. Share it. If you're on Facebook, please host a watch party in the groups that you're on. Retweet it. Tag your friends. Do your thing on YouTube. Bring this to everyone, especially those who are in the streets right now fighting for justice. There are many lessons to learn from this, and people who are in the streets protesting in particular should be tuning in. Inside Without Now is also a podcast, conversations with activists, writers, and experts on fascism and how we get out of this mess. Episode 8 is now posted, so podcast fans, find us on your favorite podcast app and be sure to subscribe, rate, and review so more listeners can get connected. Again, tonight, inside the fight to defeat the political persecution of the Freeway 9, a live discussion on the victory in the Freeway 9 case with the defendant, Chantel, and their attorney, Michael Cloud. Let's first take a look at one of the actions they were on trial for before I bring them on. As always, we want you to be part of the discussion, so make sure that you are letting us know where you're joining us from, what your questions are, what your thoughts are during the discussion, and we'll take a couple times to feed those in to our conversation. So again, we're going to take a look at what they did in 2017. And sorry, it's just taking me a moment. So this was in November of 2017. The banner says the Trump-Pence regime must go. So after that was cut down, those righteous protesters were arrested, and that was part of this ongoing case. So I want to bring on and welcome Chantel and her attorney Michael Plow to get into this and to talk about how this victory was a victory for us all. So welcome Chantel, welcome Michael.
Hello.
I'm glad to have you both with us. So Chantel, Michael's your screen's a bit dark. I'm not sure what's going on there. But Chantel, can you tell us about the case? You know, what happened? Why were you charged with such outrageous charges? What were you let people know what you were charged with? What was all this about?
So, as you can see in the video, in 2017, that was the second time we actually took to the freeway. But we were calling on people to join Refuse Fascism's call for mass sustained nonviolent protests in cities and towns across the country. And so when we did both of these freeway actions, we were arrested both times, and we were not yet charged with anything. They gave us a ticket and a court date. A few weeks later, after the second freeway action, we went to court, and they said there were no files charged as of yet. And so then we're like, okay, but they have up to a year to file charges. Then the UCLA 5 happened, and in 2018 in February, where they disrupted Mnuchin, Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury of the United States, Treasury Secretary. And after that, those defendants got tickets as well, and there were no charges filed when they went to court. A few months later, after almost a full year after these actions, we all got letters in the mail saying that we were being charged all together, and that the freeway actions, we were charged with failure to disperse, disobeying a lawful order, and unlawful assembly, which are a lot of the similar charges, I guess, that maybe a lot of protesters are facing today from these George Floyd protests. People have been taking to the freeways across the country, saying Black Lives Matter. And so it's really relevant as to why it's really important that we won this case, because I was put on trial not just once but twice, and both times there was a mistrial, which is a victory. You beat the states. And but in the process of these trials, we actually uncovered that the LAPD was doing a lot of unconstitutional spying and slandering of Refuse Fascism. And we found out that this wasn't just, about what we did on the freeway, like not the physical action, but about the politics of it all, about the message, the Trump-Pence regime must go, and that we were calling on people to disrupt business as usual. And they didn't like that, not they as in the LAPD, the LA city attorney, they were making an example out of us by, going after us with these extensive charges. And we were facing up to 3 years in prison and a large amount of fines. And it was that they were hell-bent on criminalizing not just protests, but the kind of protests necessary to actually drive out this regime. So in doing so, they were actually, greasing the skids for fascism. They were intimidating people from stepping out in the type of way needed.
Thanks, Chantel. And can you tell us why you decided to participate yourself? Why you decided to step onto that freeway, not once, but twice?
Yeah. So, I mean, take it back to 2017 when there was millions of people, like there were people protesting. People were going out. People went out for the Women's March. It was the largest, um, nationwide action like that we've seen really. And it was against Trump. And people hated Trump. People hated that, that there was an anti-immigrant, woman-hating, Christian fundamentalist in the White House. People hated it, but they weren't acting in a way that was actually, commensurate to the danger that we faced, and right at that time, he was declaring, to obliterate North Korea with nuclear war. This was before the concentration camps that we're seeing today, before the separating of the families that we're seeing. But he was promising to build a wall. He was threatening to take away women's rights. He was calling white supremacists in Charlottesville fine people when they murdered Heather Heyer. These were alarming, and people were just, kind of going along with business as usual. They would be outraged, but then they would continue on with their daily lives and not actually be acting to try to stop this now. So we were sounding the alarm. We got on that freeway to wake people up, disrupt their daily routines. And I did it because I wasn't thinking about, like what was going to happen to me. I was thinking about what was going to happen if Trump was able to continue his program, if Trump was to stay in office. I wasn't even thinking that, I had no idea it would be as bad as it actually is that we're seeing today. I mean, over 130,000 people dead from COVID because there's an anti-science regime in charge, with his hand on all the levers of power. So we were doing it to call on the millions of people to join us in the streets and to get with Refuse Fascism's mission, and to see actually, and to realize where people have power, which we're seeing today is in the streets, in our thousands, in our tens of thousands nationwide, not stopping. And that's why this demand is so important. The Trump-Pence regime must go now. Trump-Pence out now. And I did it because it was needed then, and it's still needed now. And that's why I fought through in court. And I didn't just, just take those charges, or I didn't take any deals, even though maybe Michael can talk a little bit about that kind of struggle that we were in. Because the state has a lot of power, and they were using everything they could against us to get us to back down.
Thanks, Chantal. That was really helpful. I think your point about what does it mean to see the danger, to sound the alarm, and to act for all of humanity, not just for yourself, I think is a lesson that all of us should take note of and follow your lead. I'd love to bring Michael, your attorney, Michael Plout, into the conversation if he's able. I know he was having maybe some audiovisual issues.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. For some reason, my appearance has disappeared, but it's good you can hear me.
We can hear you. So welcome, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm wondering, and I'm sure a lot of the audience is wondering, what was this prosecution all about? What, in your opinion, as an attorney, what was this all about?
I think it's about they didn't like the message that was on the freeway. I think if they were protesting on the freeway for teachers or some other let's say, less controversial group, that it would have been, it wouldn't have been filed the way it was. But because they were going after the people in power and sort of snubbing their nose at the police and the local authorities, that they decided to file.
That I think makes a lot of sense. I mean, when I as someone who wasn't involved at all and was watching it, the persecution of these, defendants really, to me, mirrored moves of this regime itself, what this regime was setting out to do at the time, criminalizing protesters, dissent, tearing up the Constitution, and attacking First Amendment rights. Can you walk us through how, and if you saw some of those things happening through the course of the trial?
Well, I think the city prosecutor was very intent on making this about breaking the law and not about the constitutional rights of each of the individuals involved. So instead of, typically what is done is all the alleged individuals are tried together.
Mm.
And in this case, they tried to break all the people into many groups of cases. Instead of one case with, let's say, 6 or 8 defendants, they decided to file 4 cases with 2 people in each case, and thus denying the collective voice of the individuals. And also, it goes against the very idea that in most cases, everyone is tried together. This is what the prosecutor wants. But they wanted to sort of make this about going on the freeway, breaking a law, and not about why the individuals felt compelled to go on the freeway. So they wanted to dilute the voices by engaging in, very surprisingly, something that prosecutors never do, which is they don't break up cases, they join cases.
Mm.
And so that was one example. Other examples is they actually tried at trial to get the judge to order that no mention of Trump or the First Amendment would be allowed.
Outrageous.
So it was if they wanted the jurors, and the prosecutor said this to the judge, and to the jury, in fact, that was being picked, that we just want you to keep your head down and do what we tell you is the law. So they didn't want even the jury to use their common sense or their right as citizens to object to this prosecution, and they just wanted someone to serve on the jury that would just follow the directions of the prosecutor and just convict simply because they went on the freeway as pedestrians.
Thank you for helping us understand that. Do you think that there's anything that we can learn from this experience in terms of the government's, let's say, understanding of the First Amendment?
I think the government looks at, well, if we're talking about protests, I think if I would be advising someone who's going to protest, I would say the more protesters you have, the less likely you'll be prosecuted.
Mm-hmm.
So that this group on the freeway, if there were 80 instead of 8 people, less likely they would have been prosecuted. 800, even less likely. So the government will look to punish those that protest in a group that is not in sufficient numbers. But once you have enough people behind the movement, then the government will take notice of their First Amendment rights. It's sort of a paradox. The government is only impressed, if you will, by the First Amendment if it's a large enough group of people.
And I think that was who Chantel and the others who participated were beckoning to join. What about the jurors? Was there anything that you learned about people's understanding of the First Amendment through this process? Considering about how the jurors responded to this case.
I think the jurors were surprised that they were required to serve on a trial like this, that they kind of felt it was a waste of their time.
Mm.
Now, keep in mind there were two trials. So the first trial was pre-pandemic, pre-COVID pandemic. And so the jury felt that this was a waste of government resources, that perhaps, sure, we don't want people on a daily basis protesting on the freeway, but at the same time, we do have a First Amendment, and we do have better things to prosecute than people who are doing something not out of their own self-interest, but for the good of the country. So I think that there was a lot of frustration there during the first trial, which is pre-pandemic. Now, amazingly, the second trial occurred during the early days of the pandemic. So the jury was even more frustrated that here they are doing their jury duty, but at the same time risking their well-being to be there for something that is so, for the prosecution of something which is at least trivial, at worst a huge abuse of power. So you can imagine frustration we had trying to keep the trial going, because we didn't want this to be a mistrial and then subjecting Chantel and the others to a third trial.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to bring Chantel back into the conversation. Chantel, I was wondering if you could share with us, what was it like to go through this trial for years? Was there anything that surprised you, that you learned about, through this process?
Yeah, I think if Michael has something to follow up on this, it's I went through a lot of different stages through this process. And when I was first, it was really important to have a team helping me, that I had co-defendants, that I had people in Refuse Fascism, and I had supporters all across the country that were, calling in to demand drop the charges. And it's just I just want to thank people that take this time to thank people that supported us through this whole process, because it made it a lot easier, and it made it a lot more clear as to why it's so important that we stuck this through to the end, and because we weren't guilty, so it was really frustrating to be seeing that, the amount of work that the prosecution was doing to paint us as criminals, like what Michael was saying, that at first they were trying to separate us all out, and they would pick on, they found me, they're like, her, because I would get stressed out, and they could see it on my face that I was really stressed out about this case. And so they were trying to force me to go really quickly into trial. And through the workings of our lawyers, and really never letting the prosecution take an inch without us fighting for us to be for the defendants to have a fair trial, and it was really important that we were able to I was able to be tried together with Alex, just so that the juries could see just a little bit of the diversity that was of the people that took to the freeway, that I wasn't acting as just as an individual for myself, that we were actually out there for this mission to, to refuse to accept the fascist America and to call on people to join us. And this it was ridiculous that they were trying to keep out Trump, try to keep out the word fascism, when you see that it's the reason we got on the freeway was political, and jurors actually recognized that. And that's what the prosecution didn't want to happen. They were diligent on trying to keep it. These people are criminals. Look, they broke the law. Look, they're on the freeway. It's like, yes, we were on the freeway, but we're not guilty. So it's a whole different thing, doing a political defense and waging a political court battle when they're just trying to keep it, when the prosecution is trying to keep it a criminal matter, when there was no criminal or no criminality in it, because it was for First Amendment. And the jurors saw that during jury selection and after the trial too. Jurors would be like, well, there's a First Amendment, and I remember the civil rights movement, and people had to do things that were against the law in order to make an important change. And so people were drawing those parallels before even knowing the full details of our case. They're like, well, if they're anti-Trump protesters, why are you prosecuting them? So there was a lot of question marks with the jurors, and they kind of saw through the prosecution, and that they were just trying to treat us as criminals. And the jurors actually bravely said, no, we're not falling for that. It's our job to to defend us, basically.
What there were some creative ways that I remember during the trial that you utilized to bring up what the content of the case was, and really put to people, which side are you on? Can you talk to us about what that was and what difference you think that made?
Yeah, I think it was really important that we had supporters coming in. They would wear Refuse Fascism t-shirts, or we had shirts that would be like, which side are you on? Kids in cages, what side are you on? Abortion, or Mike Pence wants an American Gilead, like all these different ways that we were bringing in Trump's program, and that's what we were protesting. That we weren't just out there on the freeway because we like to block traffic. It's clear through the evidence, all the evidence that the prosecution showed. You hear us chanting, Trump, Pence must go. You see the signs. You see us taking a knee against white supremacy, and we are saying Colin Kaepernick. So you see all those things, and you see that the jury just saw right through all that. And we would hold a banner up across the street from the courthouse that said Trump, Pence must go. We would we actually took the stand. Alex and I, through both trials, took the stand, and we were able to tell our story and say why we did what we did. And I think all of those things combined really just, it had a huge impact on the jury as to actually how important their role was. And they for the most part, they were on the right side of history. In the first trial, 9 jurors refused to convict. They said not guilty. And in the second trial, it was less, but it was still, people refused to convict because they saw that, we did what was right, and that we were taking a stand, and that we took a risk, and they were standing there with us. But Michael probably can speak to what it was like to, because the prosecution was just nasty. Like they really would just try. Even when I was on the stand, they'd be like, oh, look, you stepped in front of this cop car. That was malicious. And I'm like, no, man, I'm just on the freeway, and you take a step to the side sometimes. They were doing anything they could to paint us as being criminals, that we were trying to vex or annoy people. Vex is like a courtroom term, but yeah.
Let's bring Michael in. Was there anything that you learned through this process? Was, the whole process of discovery was so important to this case. Was there anything that surprised you during that process?
Well, I've been doing this for a long time, so I really wasn't surprised, but they fought us tooth and nail on every step of the way. And what's interesting is that we now have a kind of a movement towards checking the powers of the police and making this a more transparent experience when people are accused of wrongdoing by the police, that that we get to find out about the police's background. But in our case, the prosecutor fought tooth and nail to keep any information about the officer background from giving us that information, from the jury hearing anything, getting anything from the prosecutor. And this is typical, but still disappointing in this case, was that they fight you every step of the way for things that you would think would be just fairness, that we get information about why they were spying on this group, things like the background of the officers, the training of the officers, who directed the spying on the group. Every step of the way, they're trying to cover up what they did. And if they are happy with what they did, why are you trying to cover it up? It should be, look, we did this for a reason and we're sharing the information of why we're doing it. Instead, it's we did it, trust us why, it's according to the guidelines, but we're not going to give you the guidelines. It's very much the kind of secret state kind of activity. So, and I just wanted to just go back to something that Chantel alluded to in terms of the jury and so forth, that what was disappointing was that after the first trial, where 3/4 of the jury voted not guilty, that the court would not end this case. Instead, the court just said, well, the prosecutor can use their discretion and allow a second trial. And I think that that's just a horrible example of where the court, as the referee, should be saying basically, look, if 3/4 of the jurors are for not guilty, it's a waste of resources and it's not fair to have a second trial. And even after the second trial, there was never a majority of jurors that wanted to convict. And yet, both Chantel and Alex were required to sit through 2 trials. And amazingly, that the prosecutor did not immediately agree to dismiss the case after the second trial. So, you know, what I learned is, unfortunately, that the those in power do not like to be questioned or like do what they should do, which is look at the case and say, you know, the people have spoken and we dismiss the case. And the only reason they're dismissing the case now, in my opinion, is because there's so many other protests going on that, and they know that these individuals in this case are not going to lie down for them, that they're throwing in the towel. But it's disappointing that they're not doing it for the right reasons, in other words.
Yeah, I heartedly agree. You know, Chantel had talked about, you know, all the actions that they did to kind of bring the content of why they did what they did into the center. And I remember hearing from defendants at the time, there was a lot of, buzz about the case among the public during, the pre-trial hearings and the trials. I'd be interested in learning, what the legal community, including attorneys that you see in the courthouse, had to say about it. Was this something that was discussed, or?
I think attorneys, at least the ones that I spoke to, were surprised that there was a second trial.
Mhm.
That they handle a lot of different cases, and that this type of case is typically not prosecuted to this degree, and that it was surprising to them that there'd be a retrial.
Mhm.
As to the particulars of the case, I think most attorneys, especially criminal defense attorneys, are very against the current president and his politics. So obviously they felt aligned with the message of the protesters, and really nobody felt that a crime had been committed. That certainly it wasn't something that deserved of a criminal case. Oftentimes what a prosecutor can do is they can send a letter to individuals and say, we would like to have an office hearing because there's an issue about your conduct and we don't want to prosecute you, but we don't want this to happen again. And that was never offered to them, even though this is the kind of case you'd think that they would do something like that. So I think most attorneys were just surprised that this was being treated in such a heavy-handed manner. And I would add that during the trial, the prosecutor went out of his way to beg the court to stop any sort of exercise of the First Amendment outside, that didn't want any shirt being worn by members of the audience, saying anything about Trump or Pence. Again, it's remarkable that they would take the position of the Constitution doesn't apply. And here we are in the courthouse, which is open to the public, where we're deciding whether someone's actions are legal, and there's no bigger law than whether the law is constitutional. And yet the prosecutor was saying every day that the First Amendment is dangerous, so to speak, to allow it to be exercised even during the trial. That's really what I think other attorneys were remarking upon is how personal the prosecutor and the city attorney's office took this case, and they would send out like staff members from their office to film protesters outside and make these arguments that they were like 5 yards too close to the building, or these sort of ridiculous ideas that the jurors were intimidated by peaceful protests. Just these situations that, I would be embarrassed to make the argument, frankly, if I was a prosecutor. So it was that sort of frustration that, people conveyed to me.
Yeah, I can imagine a lot of it being seen just as ridiculous. How did you work together, to bring out the moral challenge that, Chantel wanted to have as part of this case?
Well, I looked at it as I had the ace in the hole, so to speak, that I had Chantel, and I knew that putting her on the stand would really be something that will work for us and provide the understanding and the empathy for a jury to not convict her and to acquit her. She's very passionate about her beliefs. And so I kind of felt that while a lot of the discovery process was frustrating, that ultimately they couldn't stop her from taking the stand. And once she takes the stand, that that they couldn't beat us. So really just trying to make her feel comfortable and understand that all the dirty tricks of the government and all the frustration of the case being drawn out for a long period of time, that, sooner or later, you're going to get your chance to talk to the jury directly. They're not going to be able to gag you in that respect. And once that happens, it's going to be worth it, because you are going to feel very empowered by the fact that you're going to be able to speak to the jury, and and it's going to make a big difference for our case. And so I felt very fortunate that Chantel is can speak well and is passionate and doesn't come across as someone who did anything lightly. That this was a critical period of time and required action, and that the action was a reasonable one under the circumstances. And she didn't come across as someone who did something rash and reckless and endangered lives. Quite the contrary.
Yeah. Chantel, I was, thinking about you taking the stand, and that the way that this was drawn out so long. I was wondering, why do you think that after almost 3 years they did drop the charges? Your attorney Michael shared his thoughts on it. What were yours?
Well, it doesn't hurt that lots of protesters have been taking to freeways, and that people have actually been really defiant. They've been getting arrested, and not just protesting on the sidewalk anymore. They're standing, they're taking on some risk, and I think that definitely helped. But also the climate, like the political climate right now. And if they thought that they could get a jury to convict us last year, and then they couldn't get a jury to convict us a few months ago, can you imagine? Like, their case just it's not going to be any different. And I think it is really absurd that they actually, I think that's the word for it too. It is absurd that they tried to this extent, that they even did a second trial, that they were thinking about doing a third because they didn't drop the charges. But you see that our mission actually poses a huge threat to the normal order of fascism, and to the business as usual, and to even the police in Los Angeles. Like, people were threatened, like the people in power are threatened by people that come out and say, we're not going to listen, we're not going to play by your rules, we're doing what's needed no matter what. And they were threatened by that. And so their idea is to, they even broke their own laws to go after us. They sent in a informant into our meetings that were held at a church. They slandered us at the police commission meetings. They went around, and even in court, they they were keeping the confidential informant out of our case, and they did a really good job at doing that. They were able to they were trying to treat us like criminals because they wanted to scare people and to intimidate people. And from stepping out like the way we did back then, because it's still needed today. That's still the kind of protest that's needed. People not just people putting something on the line. And I think they said that they dropped the case because of police availability. Because guess what? Police don't want to take the stand right now against protesters. Can't imagine why, So the police aren't the good guys. And their whole case relied upon police testimony saying that we were criminals. When all the evidence points to, like on the second freeway action, you see we had that banner that said Trump-Pence regime must go. A rogue CHP officer, if you watch that video in full, comes right up to us, slashes the banner, pulls a protester to the ground, pulls Luna to the ground, endangering us. And then traffic starts to flow around us. A police officer made it more dangerous. And that's what we're seeing today. The police officers show up to protests, and then they escalate it. The police officers start the violence. The police officers start making these loud, like the firework noises and the tear gas and the rubber bullets. It's not the protesters that are starting any of this. And it's just absurd that that it lasted this long, honestly.
I think your last connection, that you made was a really important one. And I wanted to ask, both of you, as people are taking to the streets, in a really important uprising and are taking great acts of courage while this regime unleashes more horrors, including, really repressive measures against protesters. What lessons do you hope others will learn from your experience?
I would say that people that are in the streets right now, like what you're doing is right. And it was wrong that we were even arrested, and it's wrong that any of these protesters are getting arrested. And you know what? We won. We fought it out in court. We got 2 mistrials. They dropped the charges or dismissed the case. And they're not all powerful. Yes, they have a lot of power, and they're going to use it against you, but they're not all powerful. And if we rally together, if we stay united, you stay on mission, and you can't be, we weren't wrong for doing what we did, and we weren't wrong for fighting it. There's 2 sides to everything. And if you see what we were fighting for, we were demanding the removal of the Trump-Pence regime, and it was entirely that they didn't like that message, like what Michael was saying in the beginning. And people right now have righteous demands. And if the police are coming down on you because of that, the police are wrong, you're right, and right now there's a fascist in charge, there's that want to give more power to the police, that wants to encourage white supremacists that don't like the message Black Lives Matter to run over protesters and kill, like in Seattle, Summer Taylor. This, we need to advance in these streets right now. This is a period where we actually have to unite and, keep the struggle going. And something else, like Michael said, they can't arrest all of us, we need to be out there in our millions. And
demanding the removal of this regime.
Demanding the removal of this regime. And that's how we're going to do it. And it's not going to happen anything less than that. So we need everyone to get out there, bring this Refuse Fascism's mission, demand Trump-Pence out now in the streets, and work together with us on how to make that real.
Is there anything that you wanted to add, Michael, about lessons?
I think I would add that I think people need to understand that if they protest, that there are consequences and you might be arrested, and it's disappointing, but don't give up. That you'll have your day in court, and don't be intimidated by the fact that there are police present. Don't be depressed if you have to come to court. It's unfair, but you beat the system by fighting the system, and not taking a deal, which they try to make it very tempting, if you will, that, oh, well, this will go away in a year if you stay out of trouble. They really try to keep people from exercising their rights after they're charged with a crime. And so I would tell people that if you're protesting and you're exercising your right to First Amendment, and you're nonviolent, that sooner or later you will get justice. And I believe that that you have to believe that your protest matters, and it really helps if there's a collective group, because boy, if you went out on the freeway by yourself, they're going to arrest you and they're going to prosecute you. So make sure you have some friends with you. Make sure you got a phone so you can document what's going on. But don't feel that just because they're wearing a uniform that they know what is the law and what is right, and that that change will happen if you just follow their orders.
Very, very important. I want to thank you both for joining us on Inside Without Now. You gave us all a lot to think about, but even more important, a lot to act on. That sentiment that the Freeway 9 originally acted on, that understanding of the need to sound the alarm and act with courage and determination to stop a regime that imperils all of humanity and the planet itself, is even more urgently, needed to be acted on right now. So as Michael said, get your friends, get your friends and let's act together. I want to thank both of you for joining me. And to everyone else, I'm so glad that you tuned in. Let's keep this conversation going. Please share it if you haven't yet. Now's a good time to share it. And leave us a comment on your thoughts. You can sign up to get involved at refusefascism.org. And while you're there, be sure to click the donate button so that we can reach out to many, many more people, so that we can create a situation together where there are millions in the streets raising the most urgent demand: Trump Pence out now. We will be back next Monday with author and journalist Sarah Posner discussing her new book, Unholy: Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. Be sure to DM us if you have questions about that live. It will be again next Monday at 8 p.m. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Trump Pence out now. See you in the streets soon.